now. You each have 15 minutes to make your presentation, and then we will have a session, if I'm not wrong, I think at the end, where each of you will, the reviewers will have some time to ask questions, and then you'll get an opportunity to respond very briefly. So over to you, Rob Shields, as the first presenter. I think you've been given sharing rights, so you should be able to share the paper with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul and Kishwar and Lawrence. Good to meet you. And thanks, Kim, for a great opening talk. I'm not going to share a PowerPoint. I'm just gonna talk because it's a very short time. This talk builds on some policy discussions and work on gender, space, and political economy. I'm very interested in recent work of an Australian theorist, Angela Metropolis, and I want to talk a bit about that. I will share my paper or a link to the paper in the chat towards the end of this session. So obviously, domestic spaces have been highly impacted. And I'm arguing that these are the flip side of urban public spaces and work worlds, and they need to be taken into account in any discussion of changing urban built environments. Essentially, I want to argue that, there's a changing form and manner of delineating between the intimate family sphere and public spheres of virtual platforms, work spheres, and that this is a kind of a struggle, which I'm going to call an oikopolitics, right? A domestic politics and economic politics, an oikopolitics. Essentially, I'm going to argue that it's essential to understand some of the discussions about empty downtowns, donut cities, and so on as a question of stigma rather than necessarily functional change. And that on the domestic side, we see a great deal of anxiety and affect. We need to learn this language of stigma and anxiety in our discussions of what's happening in cities. Second, I'm going to argue that there's a three-way kind of arrangement, that we're now in a spacing or a spatialization, not just of public versus private, but that it's a three-way race, if you want, between virtual platforms, domestic intimate spaces, and work places. And that this is not a division, but rather we should think using terms like saturation, that work saturates the domestic world. And we should be looking at how this may change functions in a longer period. So, so essentially, during COVID, we know that the diurnal cycle of work and private time has been suspended in favor of a blended work from home or pure isolation, sometimes for weeks, especially for white collar workers. New daily benchmarks took the place of previous routines, such as family walks, meal times, or measuring progress towards a goal. People invented personal lockdown projects. So quarantine became not only a kind of spacing, a spatial system or a practice, what I call a spatialization of isolation, but one where time for many people was experienced as stopping, as a kind of a liminal experience, to use terms from anthropology. Reductions in commuting and delivery to businesses in business districts and across cities resulted in reductions of sound levels, which were evident in a 4 to 6 decibel reduction in sound levels detected by monitoring networks. many people in Canada have attempted to move out of smaller downtown apartments, condominia, or rental apartments to suburban houses where they would have access to gardens. This has led many to talk in terms of a peri-urban future for cities, but that expansion into agricultural land is really something as a long-term fueled by government and municipal policy. A lot of the discussions of city center or business areas versus the suburbs seem to lack a lot of nuance. And downtowns, for example, are still the most served by transportation networks, and their spatial centrality means that they maintain many geographical advantages. It's true that office towers were often emptied and became irrelevant during pandemic work from home measures, but the result has been to stigmatize such business districts, adding to previous fears of rising crime and so on, or anxieties around crowding, around elevators and so on. So, but I think that we need to focus on a stigma as something that changes and as a relational affect in relation to home, garden, playground, office. All these have identities in relation to each other, and it's impossible to change or deal with them on their own. So currently, in this we see real estate interests continuing to argue that foot traffic needs to be reintroduced to downtowns at all costs. 40% of Canadian restaurants could not pay their November rent on time and in full. In Montreal, about 50% of restaurants and cafes remain closed in right across the city center, not just the downtown high-rise core. The previous speaker introduced us to the programming of retail streets and districts with green spaces or with cultural and entertainment attractions, new amenities that to attract shoppers. And this represents a shift in the broader understanding and the practical reality of sidewalks in those areas, which shift the street from a transportation infrastructure primarily to a more of a social infrastructure. These social streets are not just for traveling down. They aim to attract people to come and linger, to come and socialize. And so in place of foot traffic, they substitute lingering time. And that's a metric which has not been much discussed in economic studies. But on the internet, the time spent on a page is a very important metric, right? It means whether people are looking at it or are really interacting with it or are just passing through. In Canada, about 60% of workers with post-secondary education were able to work from home during the pandemic. In the US, similar, those with higher levels of qualifications, those employed by large firms, were 15 times more likely to shift to telework than those without post-secondary qualifications. And this is a major divide that is more and more apparent in the workforce. By August 2020, in terms of the most recent Statistics Canada data, in Canada, very similar to other OECD countries, 59% of businesses offered at least some of their employees the opportunity to telework during the pandemic. And telework is this virtual platforms. But the reality in the home is that couples and also children are working from home. Children are being schooled virtually, and this relocates the geography of workplace, of schools, of meeting friends, and career-related stresses into the home, and it adds that to domestic tensions. There have been reports of 50% increases in intimate partner violence over 2020-21. And indeed, many service sector workers, such as those in retail and food outlets, even though they were supported through central government schemes, empirical evidence connects those sort of household economic struggles to rates of relationship breakdown. And I think that that appears and is relevant to issues of mental health, to crime on the streets, and so on, and that these, again, should be thought together. The reality, as many of us in academia or professional workers know, is that we must negotiate our space. I'm sitting in the corner of a bedroom. My wife is working from an office. My dog refuses to stop scratching at the door. You know, I'm working, but I'm not in control in the same way that I might have been in a dedicated workspace. My daughter is studying university from a bedroom. My sound travels through walls. So not only rhythms and temporal and spatial markers change, but there are all kinds of tactics for mitigating and negotiating the tensions of work and family relations and practice. And often this falls unequally in the family. For many families, for example, Finnish research found that reducing the demands and managing the capitalist time regime is a female gendered boundary work. We see the intimate sphere of the family, the domestic, colonized by the work world of capitalism, and this requiring all kinds of fudging and arranging and adjusting. For example, video blurring algorithms draw a kind of curtain, not only across the interior arrangements, but a person's taste. It's the haphazard contingency illustrated by the material of everyday life in a home is kind of withdrawn from a video conference. And this creates a video conference home bubble that's bounded by a kind of gauzy haze. You can look behind me and speculate what's in the bedroom there. This is a demure alternative to finding an empty wall or an anodyne decor to put behind you, so that you can have a presentation of self, a very important sociological concept from Goffman, a presentation of self as professional, as a legitimate member of that workspace. But what happens to those not able to create dedicated sonic and visual spaces to support these new platform spaces for the world of work in the home, right? So there's this, again, it's a political struggle. It's an oikopolitics. Well before the pandemic, Robert Kelly, an expert being interviewed on BBC News, was interrupted by his toddlers who ran into his home office on screen. And very quickly, an Asian woman came in and collected them. Wife, mother, servant. Debate raged on social media. The clip went viral. People vehemently condemned him in different ways. Viewers' reactions showed our kind of racist assumptions that households should be single-race nuclear families. And in other cases, children have refused to relent. And yet the intrusion of a child or a pet into the audiovisual space of a video conference within their own home is surely to be expected. Why are we surprised that there are children?
2 minutes.
Thank you.
You have 2 minutes.
And so all of this exacerbates a shift in understandings of the home as a space of mutual obligation towards the contractualism of neoliberal welfare arrangements such as workfare. So I'm jumping a bit quickly into Metropolis's work on contract and contagion, arguing that contract thinking kind of begins to saturate the home. Now COVID is an endemic condition. Cities offer certainly an urban condition of spatial centrality. I think there are still opportunities for social centrality. But all of these new developments will respond to the new status of the household colonized for virtual work. I've called this a new oikopolitics. It's a radical shift in spatialization, even a spatial revolution in the home, which is tied to the changes in the city as a whole. So once again, stigma and anxiety, a three-way arrangement of virtual platforms, domestic, intimate, and public workplace, and this idea of an oikopolitics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was just about to stop you, but thank you for assisting me not to become cruel. So without wasting time, I think it was a very interesting presentation. We'll wait until the end for comments. But I'll right away go to the next presenter because of time constraints. So I'll introduce the next presenter, and that is Tine Hood. And the first thing you start is by introducing yourself so that we get the right pronunciation of your name. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Lawrence. My name is Tine Hood. Good morning to everyone. For me, it's good evening because I'm presenting to you from Belgium. I will share my presentation right into it. So the title of my presentation is Beyond the Great Empty, the future of the post-COVID city and its public interiors. So at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, I came across a photo series in the New York Times, which was called The Great Empty. And the series depicted the loneliness and the emptiness of iconic public spaces worldwide. And for me, it was a bit of a shock because I had been studying, researching public spaces for quite a while, and I had not often encountered them in such a state. The series also focused for a significant part on more traditional public spaces such as streets, squares, and boulevards. However, there is also a specific kind of public space, namely public interiors, which were also paused because of the COVID-19. And these public interiors became a kind of pariah spaces where few people anxiously were maintaining social distance. And I define public interiors as interior spaces which are used as public space, although they often have private ownership, and they are part of an integrated network with the city's traditional public spaces. I want to grasp this moment, this very particular moment, to re-evaluate the public interior from an interior architecture and urbanist perspective. But before I'm going to go into my observations and my findings, I think it's critical to first set my frame of reference from which I am looking at these spaces. So to quote John Berger, the art critic of the BBC series Ways of Seeing, to look is an act of choice. As a result of this act, what we see is brought within our reach, though not necessarily within arm's reach. To touch something is to situate oneself in a relation to it. We never look at just one thing. We are always looking at the relation between things and ourselves. So my relation to the world or to the context of the public interiors is to start inherently interdisciplinary, starting from interior architecture and also urban design. Secondly, my gaze is female, which is a critical position, or which is critical for public space, for public spaces, which are in majority still thought of and designed by the male gaze. Also, the way I look at the condition of public and private is fed by my European and Western culture. And furthermore, I will refer to public interiors which are situated in Flanders or Belgium, and especially in the cities of Antwerp and Brussels, because these are the spaces which I experience from within. So the Western discourse on public space has indicated different moments of crisis concerning the notion of what it means to be in public. For instance, in the wake of the fall of the urban of the Berlin Wall, we saw the debate on public space shifting towards a narrative of loss, expressing the deterioration of the public sphere from the traditional urban spaces such as boulevards, streets, and squares to large indoor public spaces like the shopping mall, accumulating in cyberspace. Also in the 90s, we saw that debate or the focus on public space shifted from the inner cities to the urban periphery, which led to a kind of new typologies of public space, which work in a network logic. In the same period, Manuel de Sola Morales observed an interesting dynamic, namely the urbanization of the private domain, which gives expression to hybrid places with an important collective meaning, although they are often in private ownership. So fundamentally, crises in the diagnosis of public space often come down to shifts we see occurring in a kind of dialectical thinking on the binaries, public-private, interior-exterior, individual, collective, and domestic-urban. However, as crisis creates a momentum for change, I want to investigate whether there will be an actual change in how we occupy or how we use public interiors. So after months of quarantine, people were allowed to physically meet again, but be it under some restrictions. So we witnessed that public life increasingly took place outside. However, due to social distance regulation and often insufficient ventilation, public interiors were closed off and became pariah spaces. In this chapter, I want to address the challenges imposed by the corona crisis on the public interior by looking at some essential characteristics of these spaces. And I define them as spaces of interiorization, as spaces of proximity, and as spaces of appearance. We point out some issues that may impact how we reconsider the design and layout of public interiors in the future. So to start with, the public interior as a space of interiorization. This fundamentally touches upon a dialectic between the interior and exterior, which shapes the spatial disciplines such as interior architecture and urbanism. So primarily, it means that the experience of being in an interior signifies the creation of an inside where simultaneously an outside is defined. So categories like interior, exterior, and public-private have evolving meanings and degrees of permeability through history. So this dynamic interrelation between interior and exterior has produced several distinctive configurations or images of public interiors representing different moments or phases in society. One of these particular configurations is the figure of the passage, which is a strong example of a paradigm shift that occurs throughout the 19th century, where a clear distinction between interior and exterior begins to contaminate and even inverts. These street-like interiorized spaces unfold a kind of idealized environment, which is expressed by Walter Benjamin as a city, even a world in miniature. The figure of the passage actually preempts this process of imagining the world, which we find also in, for instance, the Crystal Palace of Paxton, which is maybe the most symbolic of this leap in scale, which we still witness today. With the advent of air conditioning and climate control, we saw an acceleration of the complete dissolution of the boundary between interior and exterior. making even place for a new kind of condition, a kind of horizontal territory of interconnected layers, or maybe a continuous interior. The architect Mark Pimlott recognizes this configuration as the theme of the network, where many contemporary public interiors consist of a system of interconnected interior spaces that are often part of more extensive urban networks. Within the systems, a kind of total control of atmosphere, people and groups prevail. But we saw in the pandemic that there was a limit to this aura of control, because precisely these artificial environments became a health risk because of lack of sufficient natural ventilation. So, and also the increased chance of close encounters within indoor public spaces made them less manageable. After a lockdown period, being in public was only limited to exterior spaces like parks, squares, and the streets. However, in dense urban areas, this partial relocation of interior activities into the exterior also exposed a distressing lack of open green spaces that can accommodate urban social life. Susie Attewell points out the criticality of living in a city, which lies in this carving out space for activities such as eating, drinking, playing, and socializing, which naturally burst out of the standard accommodation people live in. So it are public interiors that often produce areas where we can perform these functions. However, during COVID, they were no integral part of the network of urban public space. They were closed off. Because of this, we witnessed an increasing spillover of these articulations of the public interior onto the streets and squares. So we saw do-it-yourself structures that arose to create intimate areas for people to meet in open air. These configurations, derived from architectural enclosure, gave the exterior the feel of an interior by introducing the human scale proportions. So this kind of spillover effect can be looked at from different perspectives. We can recognize this as the phenomenon of public interiority, which is a term used by Liz Testa, which means a kind of situational condition of interior making, which happens in the public sphere, but without any structure. It is a kind of blurred condition where typical interior activities occur on the exterior and reshape everyday settings for people. However, this increase, okay, thank you. Spillover of the interior into the exterior signals also a dangerous condition, namely the expanding privatization of the public domain. The philosopher Lieven de Kouter calls this extreme capsularization, with the face mask as the ultimate mini capsule. So he saw that large-scale indoor spaces were further partitioned in a kind of archipelago of insulated mini spaces, where in the situation that the scale of the interior space was too small to implement a social distance regulation, we saw a spillover to the external environment, creating new typologies like, for instance, this capsular terrace.
Perhaps closing remarks, perhaps?
Okay, so I had a lot to go through, but I will just go to my conclusion. Give me a moment. Okay, so to conclude, it is essential to acknowledge that we are still amidst the current health crisis, and that today's temporary changes like the spillover effect may not lead to permanent transformations in the way we use and design public interiors. However, the observations we make today may help us pose critical questions about future research on and the design of public interiors. For instance, what is the future of these large-scale public interiors? Will we observe changes in the layout and regulations of public interiors? Will we change the activities we do in these public interiors? And what kind of public will be occupying public interiors? So we observed several temporary shifts in the articulation and meaning of public space in specific public interiors. These experiments may catalyze long-term systemic changes or not. However, to end with a positive note, the current crisis has opened up the opportunity for designers to reimagine the concept of the public interior as an open, robust, and inclusive structure with a high degree in the flexibility of program and permeability of different spheres. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Tine. It was indeed a very beautiful presentation full of, raises a lot of questions and a lot of ideas also, a lot of theoretical discussions.
I had a lot of visual material to follow, but we don't have time for it. So.
But I think your presentation was nice. We understood you very well. So maybe we now the third.
Can we share your PowerPoints if you're interested? We'll follow up with you on that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So we go to the third presenter for the morning. That is borrowing public space, livelihoods on the pavements of Hanoi before and during the pandemic crisis. So Min Tai, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Right, thanks a lot. Hope you guys can hear me. Let me share my screen.
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
Okay, let me see.
I'll remind you when you have 5 minutes to go and when you have 2 minutes.
Can you see my screen? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool. All right. So today I'm gonna share my research about the public space in Hanoi, and I would like to highlight one of the phenomenon that people usually practice in the public spheres in Hanoi, that is borrowing public space. And I have conducted this research over the last 6 years, and a third of which is during the COVID-19 crisis, which has been an opportunity for me to compare the ways in which peoples in Hanoi use the public space. And it allowed me to highlight how the public space has been quite important to some particular group of people, and how, the way that they use the public space, how it has changed before and after the COVID-19 crisis. So for those who are not very familiar with Hanoi, this is the capital of Vietnam, and it is characterized by high degrees of informalities and co-production practices. So the public space in Hanoi will be the main focus of my presentations, and I will compare the patterns of use in the public space in Hanoi before and during the COVID-19 crisis. It's hard to say, after the crisis, because it's happening now at the moment in the city, but certainly it will offer some lessons for us to think or to rethink our city and to think our city in the post-COVID-19 period. So this is the capitals of the country, and there is a lot of people living in the city. Many of them are not necessarily work in the formal economic sector, so therefore they informally generate their incomes through small-scale businesses, and that has been quite significant over the course of the history of the city, and it forms what is called, Asian urbanism, if you like, or it's informal urbanisms. Too many pupils living in Hanoi, whom is not just a home, it's a critical basis for their livelihood. And since people live in a very tiny house, they tend to extend, they turn inside out and outside in the relationship between the public and private, and they borrow the public space for lots of different everyday activities, and they form what is called the pavement economies, mostly conducted by micro-scale businesses, many of which own rural urban migrants. So in this presentations, I frame it around three concepts. This is strategies and tactics, to borrow the terms from the Sertals, and co-production practices, which is highlighted in the studies of a Nobel Prize winner, Elinor Ostrom's. So essentially, in Hanoi, there's a long tradition. There's a very good balance between government strategies in makings and managing the public spheres and people's tactics in terms of borrowing, using public space, and even refine or retuning the public space for their everyday activities. And co-production practices that happens not only in terms of delivering the service, as highlighted by Eleanor's, but also in terms of making and remaking public space and delivering critical services to many, many people living in the city where the government not necessarily be able to do that. So the pavements and the marketplace probably is the characters or very much create the sense of place that we call many people who visit the city often see it. So we usually see the pavements and the marketplace at the forefronts of informalities, where we see lots of negotiation, collaboration, and conflicts between different stakeholders who shares and use the space. So in order to keep in order to make the city's functions, there is a networks that link the cities to the rural area. There's a networks between producer of goods, farmer, supplier, and the wholesaler, then the vendor, and between the vendor as well, in order to deliver, in order to take the goods and deliver it to cities and sell it to the end user or end consumer, that is resident people living in the city. So the pavement and the marketplace is a critical size that I believe that we should look into, because it will offer lots of lessons about how the city functions and how the people, the balance between strategies and tactics, as well as how people co-produce the city. And within that size, we see other practices, that is resilience and qualities, that is the resilient coexistence and sympathies. We see that small scale businesses are very sharp in terms of observing the market and fill in the gaps, where they see the opportunity. They are very opportunistic sort of group where they can fill in and provide affordable goods and services. And it turned out that they are very important to a large part of the community, because not all, thank you for the sale, because not all the people can afford for more services. And the public space in Hanoi are very well organized and is fully utilized by various types of users. So that sort of balance has changed during the COVID-19 social distancing period. So the government of Hanoi employed two different strategies to deal with COVID-19. That's the social distancing, in which there is no social gathering. They forced to close small-scale non-essential business, informal marketplace, and no intercity travel. That's essentially block large groups of poor residents in the city, and they forced to lock down neighborhood with positive case. And in that kind of conditions, we see new tactics emerge. We see vendor have to trade in designated area. They practice good hygiene. They employ internets and technology to reach to customer. So Facebook, Instagrams, Zalo, that is a kind of Vietnamese social network, has been very popular between either sellers and buyer, who use those as a platform to find each other. And there are some other people who not necessarily be able to adapt. They will take the risks. They will keep moving, and they will try to generate some incomes. Otherwise, they have to cut their meals off. For those who even can't do that, we see some grassroots initiatives to provide support to the urban poor. The image that you see over there is some examples of what people in Vietnam calls the rice ATMs, where people can just come in and press the button and they can receive some rice, and then they can bring homes. So that sort of low-level horizontal support has been very important during the times where the government's not able to provide any timely financial support to the invisible citizens that are the poor worker and rural urban migrants. So during the stay-at-home order, the government forced to close, all the public space. Household only allowed to shop twice a week and using the shopping permit. So that led to the deaths of public space. But essentially, during that times, we see different tactics. We see people struggling and find another way to actually expose themselves to potential customer. Marketplace go virtual. We see people establish sort of green zone in which they claim there's no case in here. So they fence it off, they create a gated communities, and that would allow them to exercise or play in that green zone area. In the checkpoint, in the fences, hard lockdown fences, we see advertisement boards of small scale business. They put up there, they're trying to reach, thank you for the sales again. They're trying to reach the other customer. And they find some other ways to, to actually keep the community going, keep the society functioning. We see volunteers connect farmer producers and deliver goods and service to the community, make sure that people have access to fresh food. And we see that also vendor employ some sort of wartime tactics to actually keep the business going and to maintain and to be able to generate some incomes. So why are these important? This is important because we look at the space, we realize that there are some invisible groups of people in the communities, from policy making point of view, from urban planning officer point of view. We see the public space are very important for them. We see the public space are also made and remade by them and fine-tuned by them. We see, the relationship between the public and private realm. We see, the roles of urban poor in the city, but also the roles of public space to the urban poor. We see that how the city should be planned and how the public space should be designed for the majorities, but also for the minorities. So the question that I left at the end of my presentation is, where are the street workers, and how should they be positioned in the urban future? And hope that I stay within the times. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Min. I think that was as well a very clear presentation.
Okay, this is the text about the present situation with COVID measures we have here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and illegal settlements, actually, which are specific context inside the city. Vedad will explain the introduction about the informal settlements in Sarajevo, and I will continue later.
Okay, I'm Vedad. Nice to see you all. I will give you a brief introduction, basically historical background about informal settlements here in Sarajevo. Basically, they have been a topic of public concern within the city, probably since first urban plans were introduced to the city. If you trace local newspapers, even back to beginning of 1900, you can see that story about informal development of the city did not change much. Even in the period of Austro-Hungarian Empire, newspapers were writing about informal houses, which people were building on the edges of the city. Later on in Kingdom of Yugoslavia, in Socialist Yugoslavia, as well as they do right now. Related to this article, the period of Socialist Yugoslavia is probably the most interesting one, because this is the period when we had, let's say, two opposing tendencies within the city. First, serious attempts of city authorities and state government to regulate the growth of the city and infrastructural development, including a massive housing developments which were happening all around the city. Basically, this planned development was happening on the east-west axis of the city in the flatlands, because Sarajevo is sitting inside the valley. And while this massive development was happening in the flatlands, another much more quiet but equally intense development was informal development was happening on the north-south axis of the city, basically on the hillsides. This was the period of massive urbanization of the city, when hundreds of thousands of workers were coming to live in Sarajevo, mostly from eastern part of the countries, less developed parts of the country. They were like economic refugees at that time. A lot of people were coming also from the neighboring Yugoslav republics, such as Montenegro, which were a bit less developed. Basically, it was the period of modernization. But what is particularly interesting in this case, that this was happening inside the socialist regime, inside the system which was claiming that all people should be treated equally, and it was based on the narrative of equality. Basically, in Yugoslavia, the system treated at least at the level of narrative, was treating the right to have an apartment or to have a roof above your head as a human right, kind of. That was the narrative. But in reality, informal settlements at that time have started to become an image of inequality, because the image of inequality inside the city, because laws were corrupt and they were favoring the managerial elite of that time. Surveys which were done at that time in 70s and 80s, which were kind of kept hidden from the public eye at that time, show that only 30% of these apartments that you see on this slide were given to ordinary workers, and 70% were given to managerial and political elite of the city. On the other hand, these small roofs that you see in the bottom of this slide are all those informal houses hosting the workers. Basically, this is the picture of class division within the city, even from the period of socialist Yugoslavia. Another period, which is our period, I would say, is the period from 1996 till nowadays. It's the period after the war in Bosnia. The major difference between the previous period and this one is that informality has become a way of developing the city. There is no opposing tendency as there was in socialist period. The reason for that is migration again. For example, Sarajevo was the number of refugees which came to Sarajevo during the war was around 300,000. It is like the huge scale for a city which altogether has 500,000 inhabitants. The number of refugees almost doubled. The number was almost like 50% of the inhabitants, local inhabitants. And after refugee programs failed, after the war, many of them decided to stay in Sarajevo and to build houses on their own. This was a huge flood of informality happening inside the city. The city authorities were numb, and many people started, powerful people started to behave in this situation opportunistically, because huge investments inside the city started to behave in terms of development in a similar way as all these small houses did. So right now we are still struggling with informality and hoping to get a grip on it, because we have huge problems within the city in terms of pollution and landslides and water shortages. And those are all problems which are to be solved in the future. Isra, please continue.
Okay, thank you. So the other part is based on the theory of using the social capital, actually, which is based on the social capital as established social network or the relationships. But it's based on Hernando de Soto and his theory that illegal settlements are actually the opportunity, not the problem, because the situation which we have here in Sarajevo is that very majority of the people who are socially maybe they're not poor, but they are living on the edge, let's say, on that line. So it's like opportunity for them to have the roof over the head, and also to make some business. So in order this usage of the social capital in Sarajevo was examined on Zavrđa settlement. It's a one settlement in Sarajevo. We actually invested all this people who live there and made a survey. And the survey actually showed that the major part of the settlement are the people who came here to live after the war. The land was registered as agricultural land, and this is the major problem because this housing was actually illegal in the first phase. In the second phase, some of the buildings were weren't, they're not illegal, but the major illegal houses were built because of lack of project documentation. Regarding the organization, there is very organized, actually. There are some big parcels which are bought by one person, and then after they were divided between the family members, also friends and some families. So they organized themselves in order to have some kind of social order. So they didn't have any plan, but they regulated the heights of their houses. They regulated the streets, even the lines between them. So there is also regulation in the organizational labor work for the the poorest ones in the settlement, and also there were some financial helping for the from the family who live abroad, etc. Everybody, majority of the people who lived in the settlement are unemployed or in retirement. There wasn't a case of specific agricultural usage, even if though the land was registered as one of those before the war, before this pandemic period. The thing which was majorly changing during COVID, it was like because it was the change in open space. The transformation which happened inside the settlement, there were a small transformation of the built structure in order to adapt the spaces more, or some additions, but small ones. And in Sarajevo, because it was a specific case of this, we have a period of total lockdown to some open period. And so the people who didn't have resources or didn't have houses outside the cities were condemned to live inside small apartments. And then the people who didn't have, the people who lived inside the legal settlements, they had the opportunity to use the open space and to transform their houses and the open space into something more. The transformation which happened were mainly in open spaces. They had a yard which was transformed mainly to some gardening or some greenhouses. The people transformed their houses also because they had family members who lived in apartments inside the cities. So they were gathering all the members who had no other choices. So the transformation inside the house was mainly addition of other family members, and outside it was these beautiful gardens that opened, and they were even more using the spaces for agriculture like it was supposed to before the war.
You could make your concluding remarks, perhaps?
Okay. So the conclusion was that everybody in this settlement, legal settlement in Sarajevo, had the opportunity to cultivate their food, to use the open space, even together with family, which wasn't same for the poor ones who lived inside the city. So the pandemic shift once again showed the possibility of this open concept, which was incremental in some way. And illegal settlement in Sarajevo showed the ability to change according to the new context and specific this pandemic and the lockdown measures. And it meant the opportunity to normalize the life of its users at the same time. So no matter the status economical or social they belong. Thank you for your attention.